Fred?
We can start by talking about your dog.
Fred.
Yes. I am all for dog content.
Well, you now have dog content.
Yes.
So,
we can bring it. Can I bring my dog in behind? He will definitely not be as well behaved as Amy's. Oh, we see some movement over there.
Good time.
There's some movement.
Fred sensed that we were going live, I think.
He did.
All right. So we are, in fact, going live. We are, I believe, hopefully, here today, back on Word on the Street live, 4 p.m. Wednesdays Eastern. That is our regular time. And Elon and I are both here together in the office. This is a very difficult week for anybody in the worldwide Jewish community, and especially, of course, in the Australian Jewish community. And we had been planning to have a long time friend of ours, Amy Spitalnick, on to discuss issues related to anti-Semitism and the way forward in trying to combat it. That had been pre-planned, but it is unfortunate that we are gathering in the wake of the events of the weekend, and at the same time I also think really timely, because I really think what we have to talk about is going to be very, very relevant. And Amy, you've got just so much experience with all of this, and I'm looking forward to it. We're just going to give it a couple more seconds for folks to join in, and then we will get started. But please, for those who are joining us, go ahead and hit the heart button and like our content, because it is a way for us to get a greater audience, and it moves us up in the algorithm at Substack, and we appreciate that from folks who are watching. So today we're going to have a bit of a deeper dive on this whole question of anti-Semitism and how best to combat it with Amy Spitalnick, who is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. She has been working on these issues at the intersection of the fight against anti-Semitism and against extremism and for civil rights for quite some time. She was leading an organization that was formed to support the lawsuit brought after the Charlottesville incident that we all remember so well from 2017. The lawsuit was a groundbreaking victory against the neo-Nazis who perpetrated the awful events of that day, responsible for that. But as importantly, I always do stress, Amy, that you are a J Street alum, our very our first press secretary, and it haunts you to this day. There are those who don't like us all that much who still refer to you, even almost 20 years later, as if you still were in your first year out of college working for us. But it is
amazing. You would think that you would have thought that I was pulling a paycheck from J Street for all these 20 years that they say I've been working for you. I have not.
Exactly. But it's been quite a career, and I followed it obviously very closely. And now you're running one of the major legacy organizations in the American Jewish community, which for those who don't know the history of the JCPA, Elon, it had been essentially a national umbrella organization for community relations councils, and there are over 200 of those around the country that are the public affairs arm, essentially, of a local Jewish community. You're taking JCPA in a slightly different direction, and we're going to talk about that, about the role of the organization in thinking these things through. But Elon, why don't you get us started?
Sure, and Amy, really great to be with you. This week of all weeks, as Jeremy said, we pre-planned this particular discussion, and for all the wrong reasons, it's become incredibly timely. But we did have this just horrific attack in Australia this weekend with 15 people killed, including a 10-year-old girl, a Holocaust survivor, Alex Kleitman. Just tell us what your initial reaction when you first saw the attack, and just your initial take on where we are now.
Yeah. It's heartbreaking, of course, and it's tragic. And also, I feel like I have this conversation far more often than any of us ever should, where I'm having a conversation or an event on anti-Semitism, and we say, little did we know just how relevant it would be. But that seems to be the case every week these days. It feels like it's really coming from all directions. It's pervasive. It's hard to go a week without seeing some sort of anti-Semitic violence or other anti-Semitic conspiracy theory or trope getting the attention, frankly, it should in terms of being called out, but also really just illustrating how normalized and pervasive it's become. And so in many ways, we know what this looks like, unfortunately, at this point. I think, while shocking and horrifying and tragic and heartbreaking, I'm not sure too many people around the world in the Jewish community were surprised that something like this happened, because we've just seen an increasingly normalized cycle of anti-Semitic hate targeting Jews simply for showing up and exercising our faith or our identity, or in any way. And that is not anything that should become normal, even though it has certainly become so normalized over the last few years.
Yeah, no, and when you talk about that normalization process, I was just thinking about it as you said that just now. And look, when you're a professional and you work in these spaces, you kind of get used to things you have to do. And it feels like after the last few months, maybe it's the last couple of years, but especially the last few months, it's almost like there's a playbook. And now my brain just kicks into, here are all the things we have to go through and think about and do. And that's a horrible place to be if you actually think about it, because that means this is usual enough that it's now just routinized, right? It's not complicated. It's not complicated for a staff like JCPAs or J Streets to, I mean, it's complicated in that everybody's got huge feelings and emotions about what is happening, and it's terrible, but it's not complicated in terms of what do we do to respond, because sadly we all know how to respond. It's almost automatic at this point.
That's right. And I think, I was talking to a friend on Sunday when this news broke, who works in sort of similarly challenging spaces. And we were talking about how those of us who tend to work in these spaces don't even really get the time to emotionally process what's happening. And I think that's true for many in the Jewish community, right? Whether you are thinking about the implications on your synagogue, taking your kids to Hebrew school that day, or your Hanukkah celebration that night, or running a Jewish organization, or otherwise thinking about what you need to do to make sure that we're responding to this effectively. In some ways, it makes it that much harder to actually process the horrors of it. And we need to do that too, because we're dealing with real trauma in our community. We have, certainly for the last few years, but for the last decade, as we've seen this anti-Semitism and broader extremism become so pervasive.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say maybe that you could help us to try to, you are in this every single day and really have a good 30,000 foot view of the broader patterns here. This was an act perpetrated by two people who had professed some affiliation to the Islamic State, and they were clearly coming from one particular political point of view. But you also, as I said earlier, led the charge on the Charlottesville lawsuit, and that was from a right-wing, ethno-nationalist, white supremacist, neo-Nazi point of view, and sort of give us a sense of how this attack and all the things that we've been seeing fit into broader patterns that you can try to give us your read and make some sense of.
Yeah. So look, it really does feel like it's coming from all directions right now, right? Across the ideological spectrum, domestic, foreign, we can talk about all of that. But at the end of the day, so much of this anti-Semitism that we're seeing is fundamentally rooted in the same conspiracy theories and tropes. And so it's easy to understand anti-Semitism as a form of hate or prejudice, hating Jews because of who we are, or what we look like, how we pray or don't pray, what we eat or don't eat, and all of the other reasons people tend to hate us if they do. But what's unique about anti-Semitism is that it operates as this insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory rooted in tropes and lies around Jewish control and power. And that's what makes it so salient in all of these different forms that we've talked about, whether it's on the right or on the left, or those professing their allegiance to the Islamic State, as we saw in Australia this weekend, or in some cases fully removed from the ideological spectrum. It's just this very salient wedge, because as this conspiracy theory, it's intended to pit communities against one another, to sow distrust in our institutions and our democracy, and make it seem like people have no choice but to resort to violence to take back control, to deal with this feeling of sort of helplessness that they feel related to their distrust in our government and our institutions. I think for many of us, it was, at the time, 8 years ago, hard to understand what Jews will not replace us mean. Now we very clearly know what it means, right? This idea that there is an effort, a shadowy cabal of Jews seeking to replace the white race to support immigrants and refugees coming up into the United States, to change our electorate, to support Black and Brown communities, to otherwise replace the white Christian, male, straight demographic that these white supremacists and neo-Nazis believe should be the basis for this country, this ethno-nationalism. And of course, we've seen how these conspiracy theories have moved from the fringes to the mainstream, fueling a cycle of violence like Charlottesville or Pittsburgh, which was the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in U.S. history, Poway and Chabad out in California, attacks like El Paso and Buffalo, which targeted the Latino and Buffalo communities under the same, motivated by the same conspiracy theories, and of course are now also being used and normalized by those in the highest positions of power in our government to justify draconian, dangerous policies, anti-immigrant policies, rollbacks of voting rights, and so much more. And so we've seen how those conspiracy theories around Jewish control and power have really been normalized on the right, fueling violence and this broader dehumanization and attack on our democracy. I think it's been harder for some, particularly in progressive spaces, to understand how it manifests on the left or the other end of the political spectrum and as it relates to Israel. But it's important to understand that these same conspiracy theories and tropes around Jewish or Zionist control and power have become normalized, particularly since October 7th, but in some places long before then, in a way that is, at first leading to the targeting of Jews under the guise of holding us accountable for the Israeli government's actions. My own synagogue after October 7th in New York, for example, seeking to marginalize or remove or ostracize Jews from certain spaces unless they meet certain litmus tests related to our relationship with Israel. And of course, as we've seen over the last 6 months or so, increasingly violent attacks on Jews, again, under the guise of protesting Israeli policy. The attack on Governor Josh Shapiro's home on Passover in Pennsylvania, firebombing there, the attack at the Capitol Jewish Museum, the shooting that led to the death of 2 people, and the attack in Boulder, Colorado on the walk for the hostages. And now this weekend, while we're still learning exact details, seeming, again, 2 people who have seemingly pledged allegiance to ISIS, to the Islamic State, targeting a Hanukkah event. Very much, I would assume, motivated by some of these same conspiracy theories and tropes related to Jewish control and power, Israel, and otherwise. And so that's what makes it so salient across the ideological spectrum in a way that is important for us to understand if we're going to confront it. But we're also being offered false choices on both ends of these spectrums. On the right, we're being told by the federal government and others that the only way to confront anti-Semitism is to undermine our democracy and the rule of law and attack our academic institutions or our unions or other things. And on the left, we're being told that we can't possibly be proudly Jewish or have a connection to Israel and also maintain our small d democratic or humanitarian values or a commitment to Palestinian rights and dignity. And so these false choices are reinforcing the binaries that in turn make anti-Semitism more pervasive. And we're in this feedback loop where it's being used to pit communities against one another and undermine our democracy. And as our democracy is undermined, anti-Semitism is allowed to further flourish and thrive. And we need to break that cycle.
So I want to that's a really great lay down.
Yeah, that was
really awesome. Just I'm not.
You would
sure
think you do this every day professionally. I don't know. That was quite good.
Really, I really wish we didn't have to, though.
No, but you really got that was beautifully explained. I think people really value that.
Yeah, in terms of just the connection from left to right and the commonality, the common, I say trends that go throughout. And it kind of leads into what we wanted to talk to you about next, which is, okay, how do we counter this, right? And I know there's some out there, there's one argument out there, which is basically one that I think is more prevalent in the Jewish community than it has been in the past, which is the answer is we got to focus on our community first, right? And that's the only way that we're going to do this. Or as, the shorthand I've heard is, when the plane is going down, you grab the oxygen mask and put it on yourself first, which I really have some issues with that particular analogy. But, the other approach is, I don't think that's your approach. So I'm interested maybe instead of, rather than describing your approach, to hear how JCPA approaches it and really in terms of building unity with other in coalitions and reaching out to others and other minority groups.
Yeah. Well, look, JCPA has been around for 81 years. It was founded in 1944 at a dark time in Jewish history when Jews here were quite literally trying to bang down the White House door to get them to pay attention to what was happening in Europe and to help save European Jewry, and not succeeding. And so there was this recognition in the Jewish community that we need to build strong cross-community coalitions because that's what's inherent to our own safety. That's how we build the political power and the political will to actually make sure our government and our leaders are doing the right thing to keep us all safe. And so that's been at the core of JCPA's worldview for the entire 81 years of its existence. We co-founded the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights in 1950 with the NAACP and a number of labor unions. I proudly sit on the board today, and we work in deep coalition with the hundreds of organizations there that are part of the Leadership Conference. We've mobilized around a variety of issues for those 81 years, particularly with a recognition not only do we need to build strong coalitions within the Jewish community across lines of difference, which is something that our own community is grappling with in ways we certainly, I'm sure, will discuss here and requires real sort of self-reflection. But also, do we need to build those coalitions across lines of difference? Because we're not going to solve anti-Semitism. We're not going to keep ourselves safe by talking to people with whom we already agree on everything, with who already understand why anti-Semitism is a threat, not just to Jews, but to all communities, as we were talking about. And so that's really at the core of our work, this recognition that inclusive democracy requires Jewish safety, and Jewish safety requires inclusive democracy. And all of that requires us to work across lines of difference in order to advance the policies that will keep Jews and all communities safe. And frankly, I think, what the post-October 7th reality that we're in, and there has been real pain and isolation, and we shouldn't be gaslit into thinking that everything is okay. There have really been painful comments and abandonment and isolation that we've seen from certain allies and partners, or places where they just simply can't acknowledge what our community has been grappling with in terms of October 7th or the rise in anti-Semitism. But that doesn't mean that we should walk away from the table. It means we need to figure out a way to constructively engage and help people understand both why anti-Semitism is real and rising and their own stake in fighting it. And so for me, it's not proof of failure of community relations. It's proof of the need for more, deeper investment in how we actually build these bridges and have the hard conversations, or as my friend Eric Ward likes to say, sort of build the muscle to stay at the table at times of deep polarization and disagreement.
Yeah, I mean, you actually had, like, even in the case of this horrific attack in Australia earlier this week, right? You had the case of Ahmed al-Ahmed, right? Maybe like the one positive story in all of this horror was that at least warmed my heart personally a little bit, was seeing an Arab man, a Muslim man, risking his own life, like knowing exactly what he was going into, to save Jews, completely countering the narrative, right? And so that's just, or I know you all also did, JCPA did something with MPAC, Muslim Public Affairs Council, just this week. You could tell us a little bit about the work there. We've done some work with them. J Street's also partnered with MPAC and different things, really a fantastic organization. But this importance of building these bridges and communities also into, Muslim and Arab communities as well.
Absolutely. Look, I think the story out of Australia, Ahmed al-Ahmed's heroism is exactly the sort of stories we need to be lifting up right now, because so the most extreme voices are telling us that we're alone, that no one shows up for our community when we're under attack, that no one cares right now. And that's a core tactic of extremism, to make us feel alone and isolated. And so when people are showing up for us, whether it's individual heroes like that or those who work with us across coalitions and differences to fight anti-Semitism and hate, it's so important that we actually name it and call it out in a good way, because the way extremism thrives is to make us feel isolated and alone. And it's not an accident that so many loud voices have been telling us that we're isolated and alone for the last few years. In particular, in the same vein as, somehow this long-standing event that we were planning became even more relevant. Yesterday on Capitol Hill, we had been working with MPAC and the Interfaith Alliance and Union Theological Seminary on a long-planned event related to Muslim-Jewish solidarity to protect our communities and our democracy. not because we agree with all of those organizations or MPAC on everything they ever say or do as it relates to Israel or otherwise. I think that would be ridiculous to suggest that every organization is going to agree on everything. But rather, the recognition that our safety as Jews is deeply connected to the safety of all communities. And that at a time when the loudest voices are trying to pit us against one another, and certainly it was not just the attack in Sydney, but these horrifying, vile comments from members of Congress this week in response to the attack in Sydney, and otherwise calling for the expulsion of Muslims for the United States, or the vice president calling for a ban on immigration as a way to solve anti-Semitism. That only underscores how the most extreme voices are going to continue to exploit these situations to pit us against one another and to advance an extreme agenda, as opposed to the actual policies that build democratic resiliency to prevent hate in the first place, to prevent this sort of extremism and violence from taking place. And so the conversation that we had yesterday on the Hill was myself and Salam El-Mariyati from MPAC, and Congressman Jamie Raskin, and Congresswoman Latifah Simon. So two Muslim leaders, two Jewish leaders. You can watch it on the JCPA website. It's posted there. And it was so deeply meaningful. Salam started it talking about what happened in Sydney and the urgency of showing up for the Jewish community and calling out anti-Semitism, no matter what it looks like. And then we had powerful remarks from both the Congress members, and then we had a conversation about what solidarity actually looks like at a time of such deep polarization, of such binary approaches to how we do the work, and how more than ever we need to be leaning into this because of how this sort of extremism and the pitting of our communities against one another is a core tactic intended to undermine our democracy and threaten all of us.
Yeah, and I just really want to call out Salam El-Mariyati and the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Salam was one of the first phone calls that I got on Sunday, and he and the organization they are symbolic of all that is good in the Muslim community and in the work that they do. And we don't see eye to eye when it comes to Israel-Palestine, and that's okay. We have a lot in common in terms of our values and the fights that we're in together. And so I really appreciate their partnership, and I'm so glad you're a partner with them. I do want to just take one moment and tell our viewers, of course, we're on Word on the Street Live, our weekly pod and video cast with Elon Goldenberg and myself, coming to you from Washington, D.C., 4 p.m. Eastern on Wednesdays. I really want to take a second to plug as well our upcoming national convention. Amy, I don't know if I've formally invited you yet, but this is a good time to just say I hope you're going to be there.
Great.
And we will certainly be exploring these issues and so much more over the course of 3 days, from February 28th to March 2nd. And it will be 2.5 nonstop days of really great discussions. We're going to be setting up a studio to do this show pretty much live throughout the convention, so that people will be able to follow us who aren't able to join us. But I think in the chat right now, we're putting a little link that people can use. You can use a discount code WOTS for Word on the Street to get 20% off of your registration fee. And please do spread the word to friends and family as well. We're hoping to have about 2,000, possibly more people there, and really thoughtful, in-depth conversations about exactly these issues. So
I worked on the first J Street conference, and there were a lot less than 2,000 people there, but there were still a lot of people there.
There were a lot of people, and you were an honoree, actually, I think, at the gala in 20.
Many years after that first J Street conference.
Yeah, exactly. So
but I think it's right there.
Very nice.
There
right
it is.
Over your shoulder. Very
Nice.
Sweet. So you've got a lot of history with us, and I hope that others will create that history as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to my first one as a staff
That's
member.
true.
I've never really, I think it's going to be a whole different level of experience than what
Yeah.
I've seen speaking here or there at a conference. So I'm looking forward to it.
And the good news is, Amy, since you're no longer on staff, you don't have to attend the staff retreat the day after. Whereas Elon, there's no rest for the weary.
Yeah.
And when
See,
we're done
that's-
with the convention, we're
that's
right
rough.
into the staff retreat. So
I
if
think
you,
people will be pretty exhausted.
yeah, exactly.
It's
So
gonna
for
be
old
like
time's sake, though,
low-energy staff.
you're invited to that as well.
I'm good.
You're good. You're good. All right. Well, listen, back on track here on the topic. You began to mention the vice president's remarks, and it was Congressman Randy Fine from Florida. I saw a really awful comment from a councilwoman in New York City, essentially using the pretext of saying they're somehow trying to protect the Jewish people or fight anti-Semitism by talking about expelling Muslims or preventing immigration. This is a constant pattern with this administration and with the president and with the MAGA movement and Project Esther out of the Heritage Foundation to use anti-Semitism to undermine democracy and to achieve political ends that are actually in complete contrast to the interests and values of the Jewish community. And Amy, you've sort of been on the front line of this, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the way that this administration and, frankly, the broader movement in the Republican Party are attempting to exploit this for their own political ends.
Well, we're really being offered this false choice by the administration and by many others. They're trying to tell us the only way that we could fight anti-Semitism is to advance the anti-democratic policies that to undermine the rule of law, to attack the institutions that have all been so inherent to Jewish safety and advancement in this country. I mean, I think about my own family. My grandparents survived the Holocaust. They came here in hopes of a better life. Both my parents were New York City public school teachers, members of UFT and AFT. And it was because of the democracy here, our unions and other institutions here, that they were really able to achieve what my grandparents had hoped, and then me in turn be able to go on to do the work that I do, and my sister and our brother and my daughter now, right? And so the ways in which Jewish safety and advancement in this country have been so tied to our democratic institutions and values is clear. It should be clear to all of us, and we certainly know that when any community is attacked, it doesn't start or stop with a community, and it will very quickly lead to attacks against all of us. But I think particularly in the Jewish community, we know that we are often among the first. And so as we see this administration, use real legitimate fears and concerns about anti-Semitism, and it's important to make clear that those fears and concerns are legitimate, right? We shouldn't be gaslit by those telling us there isn't anti-Semitism, that it's not happening in all the different ways that we talked about earlier across the ideological spectrum, increasingly violent, right? It is real, and we need to be clear about that. And two things are true at the same time. It's real and our concerns are legitimate, and they are not to be exploited, or they should not be exploited to undermine our core democratic norms and institutions, whether it's the funding cuts to universities and research, gutting cancer and Alzheimer's research and other things under the guise of countering anti-Semitism, attacking academic freedom, undermining due process and other core civil liberties and civil rights of students and others, now going after the charter of a national teachers union, for example, and more broadly, using real legitimate fears of anti-Semitism to advance the sort of dehumanization and hate that we've been talking about, including the vice president's comments that the best way to fight anti-Semitism is to lower or ban immigration, which in fact uses a core white supremacist neo-Nazi talking point that has fueled direct anti-Semitic attacks like Pittsburgh and Charlottesville as his supposed solution to fighting anti-Semitism. So using an actual conspiracy theory that has directly fueled anti-Semitic attacks as the answer to anti-Semitism makes Jews less safe, not more safe. Talking about expelling Muslims or anyone from the United States, like Vicky Palladino or Senator Tuberville or Randy Fine have been talking about in different ways, that makes Jews less safe, not more safe, because again, it normalizes bigotry and hate. It scapegoats a community for the actions of a handful of people. And we know exactly where that leads for us. And so it's really, I think, incumbent on all of our political leaders and all of us in the Jewish community to make clear that we need, of course, real solutions to counter anti-Semitism, as opposed to the scapegoating and bigotry and extremism that only serves to advance a political agenda rather than keep the Jewish community safe.
Yeah, and I have to tell you that the level of chutzpah I sometimes feel is coming from the administration and from these guys when they are presenting themselves as the champions of the Jews and fighting anti-Semitism. whether it's a Pentagon press secretary who's got a long history of anti-Semitic remarks, or J.D. Vance, or, I mean, look, it all starts with the president. I used to say this, and it's kind of sad and grim, but it was always kind of funny when I was running Jewish outreach on the presidential campaign. Every once in a while, Donald Trump would do an anti-Semitism event. It's probably like every 3 or 4 weeks. And I was like, okay, this is a day where I have to be really busy. I mean, every day was busy, but this is a day where I knew what I was going to be busy doing, because Donald Trump was inevitably going to say something incredibly anti-Semitic at the anti-Semitism event. And then I would have to spend all of my time trying to blow that up and remind people that this is not how you fight anti-Semitism, by embracing these kinds of tropes and, by essentially embracing anti-Semites. And it's just nothing drives me crazier and makes me angrier in this whole debate.
Hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Well, if this administration were truly serious about wanting to counter anti-Semitism, to your point, they would not be appointing avowed neo-Nazis to senior roles in the government, like the DoD press secretary or Paul Ingrassia, who said he had a Nazi streak and, while wasn't confirmed by the Senate, was still appointed by the administration to an important role at the Office of General Services. They wouldn't be gutting the very programs that we have to fight anti-Semitism, like Title VI, which is the tool we have to protect students on campuses and in schools, or hate crimes prevention grants. They wouldn't be politicizing things like the nonprofit security grants that synagogues and others rely on for physical security measures, by trying to weave in conditions related to immigration or illegal DEIA, which is another thing that's now happening. They wouldn't be normalizing the sorts of conspiracy theories and tropes that we know have directly fueled violence in the form of invasion and replacement rhetoric. Instead, they would be investing in real democratic resiliency and real policies that can keep Jews and all communities safe. We have a roadmap in the form of, for example, the Biden-Harris anti-Semitism strategy. Tons of other, you don't have to rely on Biden and Harris for the roadmap if they don't want to, but it's a good one. And we know what the policies are, and they are not cutting hate crimes prevention funding or OCR funding or any of the things this administration has done. It's investing in those things and building the broader resiliency to hate in the first place.
So maybe the next area we did want to shift to a little bit is also, and this is one where we, especially at J Street, have a lot of conversations about, which is how you try, and interested to get your take on this, Amy, because we do it every day, how you try to distinguish on the left between legitimate disagreement on Israeli policies and sometimes even very sharp,
virulent, right?
Disagreements and criticism of Israel. And there's no question in my mind that some of it at moments can cross into anti-Semitism, but also a lot of it isn't, and is just sometimes things I disagree with that don't go that far. And I'm kind of curious how you try to distinguish between sharp criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, or if there are lines for you as you think about where things cross.
Yeah. Well, look, I think being clear that there is a distinction is actually one of the first most important things that we can do, because extremists on both ends try to conflate the fact that criticism of Israel is an actual anti-Semitism, because it serves both, right? Those on the far right who want to prevent all criticism of Israel, and those on the far left who want to say that there is no anti-Semitism and you're just trying to effectively defend the actions of the Netanyahu government or Zionism or whatever it might be. And so it's really important to start from a place of being clear that there is this distinction, because extreme voices want there to be no distinction. And so that's a core part of the space. And how we open up space for that is, I know, something that has been at the core of J Street's work since I was there, and certainly something that we spend a lot of time thinking about as well. We don't do a lot on foreign policy, really much on foreign policy, but where we can open up space for real constructive conversation around Israel, and that distinguishes between criticism of policy, even when intense, from actual anti-Semitism, is one of the most important things we can do in the conversation on anti-Semitism. And look, I think we have seen where that line has been crossed over and over again, particularly over the last 2 years. certainly before that as well, when Jews are being targeted because they're supposed to be held under the guise of holding us accountable for the actions of the Israeli government, that's anti-Semitism, period, full stop. And we need to make that clear, whether it's targeting a synagogue, whether it's targeting a Jewish individual or a Jewish event or something like that, with increasingly violent hate that we've seen. That's different than, say, protesting outside an Israeli embassy or protesting the Israeli government in a way that makes clear you're protesting those policies and those leaders in a fundamentally different way than targeting Jews to hold us accountable for the actions of the Israeli government. I think it's also important to understand that we're not even speaking the same language as a lot of people. And so, for example, terms like Zionism mean one thing maybe to the three of us, and I bet you the three of us each have a slightly different definition, versus what it means to, a college student on campus who's joining a protest because they think it's the right thing to do for human rights, versus extremist who is using the term and as a way to sow anti-Semitism against Jews. So when we started, for me, Zionism is simply the belief that Jews are entitled to self-determination somewhere in this place in the world where we have deep historical connections. It goes hand in hand with my belief in Palestinian self-determination and human rights and dignity. By no means does it suggest, agreement with or support for the Israeli government. I think the vast majority of Jews around the world, including Israelis at this point, probably share that sentiment. And it's important to make clear that I think for the majority of American Jews, we have this relationship with Israel, even if we have fundamental disagreements with its government. And when we start to hear terms like Zionist being used as a pejorative to effectively say ban and boycott Zionists from campus, or Zionist authors or artists, or there's a litmus test for whether Zionists are allowed in certain progressive spaces, that effectively, as a result, becomes a form of anti-Semitic discrimination by saying that the vast majority of American Jews who have this relationship with Israel are not welcome in that space. And so we need to understand the actual impacts of some of this language, even if it's not intended to be anti-Semitic. The real world implications of it can oftentimes be in this moment. And so too, does it make it that much more important, again, to help people differentiate between constructive, important, even intense criticism of Israeli policy and leaders from where it crosses the line into actual overt and disproportionate targeting of Jews or Israelis and sort of our right to self-determination, or however we want to think about it. And so it's having those distinctions that make it all the more important. And it's also giving people space and grace to recognize that they might not hear these terms the same way that we do, and vice versa. Think about the term intifada. It means something very specific to me as someone whose formative years with growing, with Israel were the second intifada, bus bombings, pizzeria bombings. I lived in Israel a few years later and was told by my mom never to get on the bus. I walked past the memorial at Hebrew U for the bombing that had happened there every single day. And so that's what I hear when I hear intifada. Obviously, there has been a robust conversation about how, whether intended or not, there's harm being caused by certain phrases like globalize the intifada because of how many of us in the Jewish community hear it. And it's so important to give people space and grace to recognize the impact or to understand the impact of these terms, even if it's not their intention. And that requires, again, having hard conversations, leaning into these conversations rather than walking away from the table and basically shunning people and saying that there's no way to engage with them, which is something we've seen all too often as well.
So, you said at the beginning that there would probably be even between the three of us, some disagreement on some of the definitional questions, but you've just laid it out perfectly. And I actually have no disagreement. I can't speak for anyone, but it's very rare, right? But, you really just I think precisely hit the key points there. So I want to go back a little bit to the Bondi events of the weekend, the horror of the weekend. Because I want to dig in a little bit. We've talked about what it takes to try to combat anti-Semitism, right? What does the United States need to do? What does the federal government need to be doing? What do our elected officials need to be doing? Well, the Australian Jewish community for the last 2 years has been saying to its government, we feel unsafe. There were a series of really horrific incidents, nothing of this scale, of course, but there were real physical incidents of attacks and safety, and the community went to the Australian government and said, we need your help. Um, I wasn't there. I'm only reading the coverage. Elon and I discussed this earlier. Our view is the Australian government didn't do enough. I mean, we were just shocked to hear that there were only 2 police at the event. I don't know if that's true. I've read it, and I've learned not to believe everything I read these days, but it does feel to me like the Australian government wasn't doing enough. And I'm curious, you probably are hearing a lot more and have a lot more information, but what do you know about the Australian government's response to the Jewish community and leading into this particular event, what it was doing or not doing?
Yeah. No, I mean, I very much, I was on the Hill yesterday talking with a number of folks about this as well. And there was a press conference on the Hill yesterday from members of Congress and other Jewish leaders where I think they raised some of these same concerns. And one of the things that has been clear is that not only was it the Jewish community in Australia that was repeatedly ringing the alarm bell, but actually the Special Envoy for Antisemitism has a plan that was put forward but hasn't been implemented. And so it's so important that our leaders hear our communities when we're saying this is a real threat. And over the last 2 years, as you've said, we've seen, arson attacks and fire bombings and other horrific attacks on Jewish institutions or businesses or leaders in Australia. It's not unique to Australia, but they have, I think, the largest population of Holocaust survivors in the outside of Israel in the world. There's a real Jewish community, even if it's small by in terms of percentage, and they were facing disproportionate hate and violence. And unfortunately, it seems this is the manifestation of it. But it's also really, I think, a testament to when anti-Semitism becomes politicized, right? We are now hearing sort of all sorts of efforts. I think, for example, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that the reason this happened was because Australia supports Palestinian statehood. This didn't happen because Australia supports Palestinian statehood. It happened because the Australian government and its institutions failed to protect the Jewish community in Australia. And so when we conflate those two things, it also makes it much harder to actually protect the Jewish community. And it actually plays into some of the very tropes that conflate Jews and the state of Israel or Israeli policy that lead to this sort of violence. And so we need to be really clear about what we're asking, that when we ask the government to protect Jews, it's not because we want of a particular position on foreign policy. It's because they have a responsibility to protect their population, including and especially Jews right now who are facing disproportionate attacks and violence. And so it's so important that we both hold, I think, the Australian government or any government accountable to their obligations, and also not let these real concerns be exploited to advance a broader agenda.
Yeah, I found Netanyahu's comments to just be pretty infuriating, I have to say. And it was just hours after, and it was all his ministers repeating it. And here's an irony, and maybe this is going a step too far, but I'm going to say it anyway, right? I mean, what Australia needs to do in the aftermath of this, and what any government needs to do in the aftermath, is a really serious review of how it got there and what steps it needs to take to make sure it doesn't get there again. But you have this government, of all governments, the Netanyahu government, who 2 years after October 7th refuses to have that serious review. It's one of the biggest political issues in Israel right now. Is we need a full understanding of what happened on October 7th and what the failures of October 7th were, so we make sure not to repeat them. And this government is blocking any effort at that kind of serious review, which is so essential. That's essential to Israeli safety, to Jewish safety in Israel, certainly in the communities around Gaza, but beyond that. And so on the one hand, they are saying that, and on the other hand, they're out there blasting the Australian government, which I think there are, again, we don't know everything, but from everything I've read so far, I think there's lots of reasons to sharply criticize the Australian government for its behavior and response in the lead up. But recognizing a Palestinian state, again, it goes back to that previous conversation, Amy, we were having about just conflating all kinds of things together, because like, why do we separate them? It's much easier to just conflate it all. And of course, Netanyahu jumps right on top of Palestinian state. And whether you agree or disagree with the Australian government's decision to recognize a Palestinian state, think that was a good thing, think that was a bad thing, it doesn't matter. That's not the point. That's not what led to the horrors that we saw, in Sydney just over the weekend.
No, what led to the horrors was anti-Semitism and two extremists who were able to get access to extensive weapons and a lack of protection for the community that they targeted. And so if we can't have accountability for that, to your point, if we can't have serious conversation and accounting for any failure of government to protect their population, then what are we doing here? And I think I didn't quite put the two pieces together as you just did, but I think it's an apt point to make in this moment.
Yeah, no, this need for accountability, this is sorely lacking in the case of Netanyahu. So I think, we're sort of coming to the end of the conversation, Amy, and I really appreciate your, laser focus on doing the things that are actually going to counter anti-Semitism and build a community to fight against the broader array of hate and ethno-nationalism and prejudice and racism that is plaguing not just the United States, but it's plaguing all countries all around the world. And we've got to fight this together in community. And I also really want to appreciate your leadership in sort of taking on some of the things that don't work, and really calling out efforts to codify definitions of anti-Semitism that include criticism of Israel too broadly. This is not an approach that is going to help us. It also doesn't help when people are ignoring the anti-Semitism on the left, and you do such a great job of balancing it and making it clear that we've had these issues all around us. And it doesn't help when we, as a community, turn around and demonize another community and use power and influence to try to shut something down. Whether it's research funding at a university, or it's closing the borders to immigrants. This is just not helping us. And you're so clear-minded and clear-eyed on separating out what helps and what doesn't help. And we really look to you and to JCPA for real leadership on this. So thank you for that. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the word on the street crowd?
Well, look, I think it's so easy to feel powerless and hopeless in this moment, but there's also real reasons for hope. I'll say, we talked about the solidarity of communities that have shown up with for the Jewish community in the aftermath of these horrific attacks, whether it's the statements from MPAC that we referenced earlier after the Boulder or Capital Jewish Museum or Sydney attacks, whether it's what we've seen from a variety of other partners. I think about folks like Maya Wiley at the Leadership Conference, who was one of the first calls I got after October 7th and has been such a core partner in keeping our coalition together and ensuring that Jewish safety is a core part of it as we do the civil rights work. And so many others. Right? We have a partnership with the American Federation of Teachers, and that work has been in place where I found hope. The union leaders and others who are wanting to do the hard work of understanding anti-Semitism in a way that is different than the binary approaches so many are offered. And so people want to show up, and our job is to try to stay at the table as much as possible. And again, build that muscle to have the hard conversations, to engage people. Obviously, having red lines where people are doing harm in all directions. The only way we're going to build the coalitions we need to actually effectively keep Jews in all communities safe is by engaging people who aren't already with us, engaging people across these lines of difference, and ultimately recognizing that the way we keep Jews safe is protecting our inclusive, multiracial, multi-faith democracy and the rights of safety of all, just as ensuring our democracy is safe requires us to protect Jewish safety. And we can't have one without the other. And until we break out of this binary, we're only going to see the same patterns repeat. And so I think our work, and so many, I imagine, who are part of this effort is rejecting those binaries and figuring out a path forward that recognizes this deep interconnection.
Yeah, rejecting the binary is sort of the watchword of J Street. My favorite phrase, which is my favorite word in the English language, is and trying to break that binary and make people see the end.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I'm just thinking back to as a month or two after the presidential campaign, when I was figuring out what I wanted to do next, and And that was it. That was the conclusion, that like the people I really wanted to talk to are the ones who could use the word "and," which is what we did tried to do throughout the presidential campaign too, and just in all these experiences. That's where I ended up there.
And I spend so much time on the road, and it's where the majority of people are, even if our institutions aren't there, right? Like the majority of American Jews and Americans want complexity and nuance and to hold the both end.
And the loudest voices don't want that. And, they are the ones exploiting tragedies like Bondi. And, we didn't even talk about gun control, which is another issue that we, should just quickly touch on when we discuss these things, because we also had this horrific incident at Brown this weekend. And, it is just, insane that we can't get something when the overwhelming majority of Americans and people around the world want sensible gun reform. And we can't get there because of loud voices on the extreme exploiting these issues. So,
and it's exactly how polarization and extremism undermines democracy.
Exactly. Well, I thank you again to Amy Spitalnick. I want to put back up on the screen the link for our convention in late February, early March, February 28th to March 2nd, because as I said, Amy, you don't know this yet, but you'll be there, I hope. And speaking on these and other issues.
I was just voluntold that I'll be there.
Exactly. Don't tell your board that I'm doing that. That's probably a bad thing for. But really looking forward. I hope that the whole audience is going to be there, and we really look forward to engaging conversations on all of these issues. The next couple of weeks, Word on the Street Live is not going to be at Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern, because it just so happens that Wednesdays are New Year's Eve, Christmas Eve. It's just a really bad choice of days for us to have picked in our first year. But
Jeremy, I love doing this show. I really don't want to be here at 4
p.m. on New Year's Eve.
I mean, Christmas, we get some Chinese food.
Get some Chinese,
like,
right?
We
thought about maybe we
just need something to watch.
Yeah, exactly. Probably that everybody's going to be busy watching a movie. Exactly. So we're going to do next week. We'll probably do Tuesday, I think, is the time frame. And we've got a really exciting special guest. I am not going to spoil the surprise, but we'll do something next week. Follow us at jstreet.org.substack. And then we'll be back after the new year, back at our usual time on Wednesdays at 4. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Thanks to Amy. Happy Hanukkah to you, Amy, and to Fred in the background. I am amazed that Fred managed to sleep through the entire conversation.
Me too.
I hope our audience didn't sleep through it the way that Fred did. And it's great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Bye, everybody.